Hello, everybody, and welcome to our conversation around when home isn't safe. Just to introduce myself, my name is Kira Brody. I am the training lead for Refuges Specialist Technology Facilitated Abuse and Economic Empowerment team. I'm joined today by the fabulous Lindsay Song. Lindsay, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you so much. My name is Lindsay Song, and I'm the director of the Technology Facilitated Abuse Initiative at Sanctuary for Families, which is New York State's largest provider of civil legal services for victims of intimate partner violence. And we provide services including legal services, clinical services, and economic empowerment, and other resources for survivors here in New York State. And I specialize in the area of technology facilitated abuse. So it's really great to be here to chat with you today. So to get started, Kira, let's start with defining, we're talking about when home isn't safe, the Internet of Things. What does this actually look like in the day-to-day for the life of victim survivors when we're talking about the Internet of Things and how it can be misused?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's so important. There's definitely a lot of like jargon in this space. I think it's really needed that we kind of outline some of these terms. So yeah, for anyone who isn't already aware, the Internet of Things is basically a network of like physical devices, vehicles, appliances that are technologically enhanced. So they're embedded with something like a sensor, software, or network kind of connectivity, which allows them to collect and share data. And I often simplify this in training to basically say it's your typical home device that's now been connected to the internet in some way. So smart fridges, smart locks, that kind of thing. And I think it's really important to acknowledge that while this technology can be so helpful for everyday life, it can unfortunately be used to facilitate harm, coercion, and also gaslight survivors of domestic abuse. And the types of devices that we're seeing being misused in the team are quite extensive. They're ranging from things like smart light bulbs to smart assistants to internet connected vehicles. But I think it's important to note that it's not just the misuse of the device itself that causes the harm, but it's its ability to connect and relay data elsewhere, which essentially can build this kind of like network of like monitoring or surveillance around a survivor, particularly in the case of abusive kind of intimate partner or familial situations.
Yes, that's such a good point. And I think too, what to your point about, that these devices in themselves are not necessarily harmful. In fact, most of them, really the vast majority of them are not. Of course, we sometimes do see the use of surveillance cameras or like hidden cameras. But really, what we're talking about today is kind of like normal, regular objects, devices that we use every day that are being misused and weaponized by abusers. As I sit here in my home, I'm surrounded by, hundreds of internet connected devices. We have, smart light bulbs, a smart fridge. We have a smart washing machine that like we can control from our phone, which is like, why is that necessary? But there's a lot of good things about that, right? It's very helpful. It's very useful to have these devices. And so it's such an important reminder that we're not here to say that these devices or any other devices are intrinsically bad or misused, built to be misused, but just a reminder that all tech, including home tech, can be weaponized and misused. And the information that is shared from it, while seemingly innocuous, can sometimes be really damaging and really scary and really dangerous. And even perhaps more scary is the misuse of it to kind of gaslight and intimidate, confuse, confuse clients and survivors. Um, so I think, it's just a good reminder that we're not anti-tech on this panel or any of them, but just to talk about how they can be misused.
Absolutely. And I think like exactly like you said, we definitely want the accountability to like still sit with the people who are misusing this technology. I think what we're trying to just do is shed a little bit of light around how is it being misused, because I think this is a huge area that's often really overlooked. Um, and here in the UK, because obviously I'm a UK-based organization, you're based in the US. We see a lot of that misuse of like smart assistants via like drop-in features, GPS trackers, internet connected cars being used to stalk survivors as well. Um, is this similar in the US? Like, what are you guys kind of seeing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I always love hearing from international folks and just to see what we're seeing. And I find that, abusers are unfortunately weaponizing very similar items and in similar ways. So previously, before my current role, I represented clients for 10 years in family courts and assisted with criminal justice advocacy. And so I unfortunately have seen a lot of it firsthand with my clients. We had a sanctuary client not too long ago whose abuser, there was an order of protection that kept him out of the home and excluded him from the home. In New York, we call it an exclusionary order of protection. And even though he was not permitted to be in the home, when she was not home, she came home afterwards and saw that her bed was missing. And he had remotely unlocked the home using a smart lock. He did not come into the home, but he had movers come in and take their bed because I guess he wanted it. It was like their marital home, and he just took the bed. But she came home and to a locked house, right? And then walks in, and then her bed is missing. Um, which is just, again, it's like in itself, it's not like she was there when it happened, but the violation of that, of somebody being in your home without your permission, of being able to, and just to show off, I can unlock and lock the home anytime that I want, right? You don't have any control over the safety of your own home. I had another client who was visiting my office. So in New York City, we have our family justice centers, which are walk-in centers for survivors of domestic violence, which I know globally there's a lot of different services that are similar to that. And I am based in the Queens one. And so I was in my Queens office, and my client came to meet me with her two children, and she was still living with her abuser. So she had not left him yet, but she was talking about safety planning and planning to go. And she had told him, oh, I'm going to go to this new park with the kids. And so she went, met with me, and then she came back like 4 days later to continue the conversation. And he texted her out of the blue saying, "Why are you back at that same park that you were just at several days ago?" Just letting her know, like, I know exactly where you are physically. And she hadn't told him the second time where she was going. And so it was very much an indication of, I'm tracking your location. And she discovered that he had actually installed on her car an aftermarket device. So she had an older car. So it did not come built with these, but many cars, I mean, at least in the US, I don't know about the UK, but they
Yeah.
come standard with connected, which again is very helpful. I have a car that has an app and I can turn it on and off remotely. I can, it's hot outside, you turn on the AC, you forget what you parked. It's great. It's very helpful. But her car was older. It did not have this, but it had an aftermarket device installed into it. And so he was using it to remotely track her. She went to her car dealership, her manufacturer, to say, please take this off of my car. And they said, well, no, we can't do that because it's aftermarket. Like didn't come standard with the car. So you have to go to the company. She goes to the company that installed it. And the company says, well, actually, it's under your husband's name. So he's going to have to remove it. Meanwhile, she has an order of protection against this person that he's not permitted to be around her. Not only that, but we actually got a provision in the order that he was not allowed to remotely control or monitor her or track her. So he was very much in violation of that. And ultimately in New York, and there is a bill in California that does the same thing, we were able to pass a law after this experience and the experience of others that car dealers and auto manufacturers are now required to remove access to a connected car when a domestic violence survivor comes and self-identifies. But which is great. And I don't mean to, like, I think that's fantastic, but it's also a good reminder of we are always one step behind in these cases. And we have to, see what abusers are doing and then try to adapt it in the legislation. And, we've had many clients who have had, like, there's new things coming out. We had a client years ago that had her hearing aid that was misused. And her abuser tapped into the frequency of her hearing aid and was talking. And she was saying, I think there's something wrong with my hearing aid. I can't, like, there's like voices or something in the background. And he's like, what? There's something wrong with your hearing aid. Are you crazy? Do you need to go to the doctor? Like, what's wrong with you? Totally making her feel like she had lost touch with reality. And when really it was him that was engaging. So it's really anything, like you said, like all these devices, there's so many things that have this capability. So there's a couple of our examples, but I'd love to hear some of the things that you're seeing as well.
Yeah, I mean, we're seeing this come through so much more. And when I speak with the caseworkers in the team, so in my role, obviously, I'm primarily doing training, still do a little bit of direct support as well. But the caseworkers who are seeing this come in day in and day out, the rise of things like hidden surveillance is something that they're just like anecdotally seeing so much more. And I think you touched on such an excellent like point there that people often think this area of tech abuse is so quote unquote advanced, but it's so accessible. it's so much cheaper than we think, and it's sold in so many different places. Like I've seen hidden cameras, GPS trackers that are listed online for like less than a quid, like less than £1. And it doesn't require lots of money. It doesn't require lots of like technical expertise to like install them. Um, and I think the other thing is we've started to see, you can see it online, like non-smart things that are being built with the capacity to hold a camera. So one that comes to mind is like a plant pot that's got a place to put like a hidden camera and things like that. And I think this kind of almost like legitimizes this in a weird way because it's so accessible, not just like financially, technologically, but also like socially as well. And I think that just makes it like so difficult for survivors going forward. Sorry to go off on a little bit of a tangent there, but I just
No.
wanted to pick up on that point. I thought it was like so well explained that this is not cyber criminals, sitting orchestrating this harm. Unfortunately, it is regular people who have just an abundance of access to this technology and the will to misuse it, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I think that goes exactly into what I wanted to talk about next, which is, kind of the ways in which perpetrators are using these things to control, surveil, harass. I know we gave some of the examples of kind of like watching, monitoring information, but I think it's also a good reminder too about the ways in which these technologies can be used too to gaslight and to make people feel like they've lost touch with reality, to scare them. I know that with, even something like we've had cases where with like smart connected um like air conditionings, like or like just utilities in the home. Um that we heard of a case, not a sanctuary case, but another case from another service provider that she was coming home every day and her dogs were extremely aggressive and kind of really just discombobulated and she didn't know what was going on. She's like, why are my dogs so upset every time she came home from work? And she discovered later that her abuser had gotten into her thermostat. And during the day, he was turning up the heat, like really, it was like a summer time, and he was turning up the heat. So the dogs were extremely uncomfortable. They were like ill because it was, in the summertime and it was like 80 degrees in the house. But then he would turn it down just before she came home. And so the dogs, meanwhile, have been dehydrated all day. They're like really just like weird out of sorts. And she thinks she's like, like just imagining it, like what's wrong with my dogs? But really it was something that is as minor as, a thermostat. So it's not even like he's, excuse me, he was watching her or monitoring what she was doing. He just was doing this and hoping that it bothered her and hoping that it made her feel unsafe, and it was working. I don't know if you have other examples too, in addition to kind of like monitoring, but just the misuse of them to make people feel like they've lost touch with reality or just repeatedly get, contact in ways that they didn't expect or didn't want.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think it's such like an excellent point. And yes, we do see that obviously, we do see that kind of location tracking, obviously that monitoring. But yeah, I think we really see this kind of manipulation of the home environment. So, for example, perpetrators connecting to smart speakers and then blasting out music at random times just to like disorientate survivors, being able to have access to the Wi-Fi and then blocking, potentially like access to support services or kind of needed kind of websites and things like that, setting up redirects so survivors are sent other places away from the support that they might be looking for. Yeah, we've seen similarly, misuse of those like home heating systems, so many different forms. And I think you're so right to highlight that it's important not to forget just how terrifying that is. Like, this is technology that is thoroughly embedded into our lives. And if someone is co-opting that, if someone's misusing it, it really sends this very like sinister message of like, I will always find you, you can't escape me. And that really adds that additional barrier to survivors who are potentially looking to flee or like recover from abuse because we are talking about this in the context of the home, but we should recognize that smart home technology extends past the perimeter of your house. It really impacts like every aspect of your life. Your home is meant to be your safe space, just like the title of this conversation. And it really is that manipulation that just feeds into survivors' distortion of reality often, because survivors' brains don't automatically jump to, oh, do you know what? They're manipulating the smart thermostat. They are much more likely to blame themselves, to go, do you know, I'm a bit tired today, or, it's clearly just a coincidence. People don't want to go there because of the nature of domestic abuse. They've got intimate or familial connections with the perpetrators. They don't want to think that that's what's being misused. Um, and that almost makes it slightly easier sometimes for perpetrators to manipulate this home environment and gaslight survivors further. I know I think one thing that we've not touched on yet much, I think we've alluded it to, is how difficult it is for survivors to recognize Internet of Things facilitated abuse, both for survivors themselves, but also for the professionals they work with. So, support services like ours, the courts, police. How do you see this coming across in your kind of work?
It's a huge problem. I mean, I think just like you so perfectly encapsulated, like with survivors themselves identifying what's happening, that's a huge barrier. And then once they identify it and are like, wow, this is what, I believe that I've kind of focused in on what happens, which is very difficult in and of itself. Like you're saying, that can take months, if something is happening, of like really identifying coincidences or weird things that are happening. And then once that happens, and then they go to the police or to, family court or even support, organizations like ours and try to explain what is happening, then they are faced with a whole separate barrier of, not they've already had to kind of come to terms with that and make themselves believe it. Now they have an external person who does not know the abuser, right? Who's not familiar with the abuse, and essentially have to convince them that what they're experiencing is real, which is a horrible thing. It's difficult already, right? We already know for many years, it's a tale as old as time that domestic violence victims get, very victim blaming, very dismissive mentality, even for things that are, on paper, very obvious, serious, like somebody comes in with physical injuries, right? We already know that that happens already, let alone when it comes to a place that maybe there's not as much physical evidence or it's more difficult to kind of suss out exactly what's going on. And I think there's such a layer of trauma there of having to explain and convince someone else of your own experience and that it's actually happening, is really awful. And I think I've heard from a lot of folks that that is honestly one of the most painful things about experiencing technology facilitated abuse is that nobody believes them, and trying to get people to believe them and having to go through and basically lay out their own, their own violence and what's happened to them over and over and over again. Not only is that re-traumatizing to have to talk about it again, but to have to like basically be like, please believe me, like this is actually happening. And people making, that they're crazy, or that, or even worse, like even if somebody does believe them, telling them that it's not a big deal. So we've had a lot of struggles with that, with clients. And, I'd love to hear I'm sure, unfortunately, you probably have similar experiences, where clients have come in and said, oh, I found this AirTag or this tracker in my car. And I'm sure it's my husband or my partner or my ex that put this there. And, they're told by law enforcement, well, how do you know that it was him? Like, we don't know that it was him. How are we supposed to find this is just an AirTag tracker? And spoiler alert, you could absolutely subpoena that and get information from the tracker and see who the Apple ID is, or if it's not an Apple ID, even if it's just like a run-of-the-mill tracker, like the ones that you mentioned, you can get online. There are forensic units, and even just like the district attorney's offices, police, like I do a lot of trainings in my current role for police, law enforcement, prosecutors, judges, and 911 operators. And I've learned a lot about really there's a lot of capacity to get information off of a physical device itself. Like even if it's not, subpoenaing the company that owns it, like off the actual device, like these devices have computer chips, like they have actual information contained in the devices. And if you get somebody who's willing, you can probably find a lot of information on that physical device. But that's the barrier that we face is, do we have people that are willing to? Let alone if we're going into family court where there's not that capacity, right? I mean, I struggle to even bring in, I have like a USB device and I'm like, how do I connect this? They're like, wait a second, like we need to like bring in the IT department, like roll in this, computer on a little like wheels and then like double check. I mean, tech is very far behind in a lot of our court systems. And so it's difficult to even have them understand what is possible. And even things that are kind of like low tech, like you were saying before, it doesn't have to be super sophisticated. But even then, just to get, officers, judicial officers, officers of the court, law enforcement, to people to understand, attorneys as well. I mean, I am one that focuses in this area, but I work with a lot of different attorneys, family court, civil court, criminal court attorneys who also are not familiar with these issues and are kind of a little bit suspicious and just like can feel like, can that really happen? Like, can somebody really use it that way? I don't really know about that. And so I think it's such a difficult barrier for folks. And oftentimes, in my experience, people give up after a while. They go to the police, they go to the court, they try to explain what's happening. And even if they're able to show what is actually happening, they're often, so dismissed and really just lose faith and are not able to really continue. So then they focus on other parts of their abuse that they've experienced that they feel like are more legitimate or more, I say this with air quotes because it's all very real, but that's not often how it's viewed by the court systems and other systems. So is it the same where you are? I want to hear about yours too.
I would love to say, do you know what? No, it's not the same. Very different, but unfortunately, like I was nodding profusely as you were speaking because, yeah, it just resonate with so much of what you're saying. I think the burden that is placed on survivors around this form of abuse is just so high. Like, just if someone presents at a police station, for example, and they've been hit, for example, you there's not that burden there of okay, did they hit you with your right or your left hand? Did they hit you with a specific hook, for example? I'm not saying that to be to trigger anyone, but what I mean is that survivors really struggle to understand like how technology is being misused. They often just know, we get so many referrals purely based on the fact they're like, something feels off, something feels sus, like something's not sitting right. There's been one too many coincidences, which makes it unfortunately very easy, as I said, for survivors to gaslight themselves, but for professionals to invalidate those disclosures. And then you highlighted the kind of next barrier that once you do get someone taking that seriously, maybe helping them trying to figure out, is there's a huge underappreciation of the risk associated with this.
Mhm.
With smart home technology facilitated abuse, we do still live in that society which places physical and sexual abuse above other forms of harm. But we need to move away from that kind of hierarchy of abuse structure and really appreciate just how risky tech abuse can be. During the last actual financial year, over half of the survivors that were referred into our team were actually identified as high risk. And it's important that we recognise that Internet of Things facilitated abuse has real world impacts. It doesn't just threaten the digital safety of survivors, but it does threaten the physical safety of them and their children. And it's not just about recognizing it anymore. It's about really seeing this as a very damaging and kind of scary mechanism of harm. And I think there's also the other barrier here of like, we've talked about some of the devices that you might know is in the home. Like you might know you've got a newer car, you might know you've got that app that controls the thermostat. But just like you said, there's this whole other level of abuse when we think about devices that are installed covertly. And
Mhm.
survivors have only clocked that these devices are there because maybe the perpetrators referenced something that they said in a phone communication. I've had survivors that have found the box somewhere in like the recycling, and that's been like, is it actually here? Is it not?
Ugh.
We've even had occasions where the perpetrator is like disclosed directly that they've installed a device in the home and basically left it a bit like, oh, you're never going to be able to find this, and essentially turned like the covert installation into some sort of like manipulative game where survivors are like, is it a threat? Is it real? How do I know? And that's absolutely terrifying for survivors.
Yeah. And I think too, what we often hear is, we'll just turn off the device, why don't you just, or whatever it may be, like if it's, okay, like your abuser's watching you on your Ring camera, or your abuser is using your, home light systems, like why don't you just disable them? That's not that hard. Um, but really, I mean, first of all, like nobody should have to disconnect from things that are helpful and useful to them, and it's super victim blaming to imagine that, right? Like, oh well, your abuser's using your weaponizing your car to so just like don't drive, just walk everywhere. Like, what a burden to put on the victim, the person that's experienced this abuse, right? And there are a lot of practical and safety challenges for that people reach in kind of trying to disconnect abusers from these accounts. Have you experienced that with your clients, these, barriers that when somebody, whether it be law enforcement or even sometimes advocates are guilty of
Mm,
saying this, just disable
absolutely.
it. What challenges do survivors face in those scenarios?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, as you know, the issues with this kind of just turn it off approach is that one, it's not always safe for survivors to make changes to these devices or accounts that can prompt a rapid escalation in abuse. But I think the next issue is that if your home has been compromised through Internet of Things facilitated abuse, the next issue there is not necessarily how do we secure the device, but how can we even communicate safely with that survivor in the first place? How can we communicate with them to maybe identify the issue and actually safety plan? It might require a new device that's not connected to the Google products in the home, for example. They might feel safer having that conversation with services in certain rooms or away from the home entirely, outside of the car. Safe communication and actually appreciation of the risk, they have to be in place before we even start to think about safety planning. Otherwise those conversations we're having could be putting that survivor in greater danger. And once again, that kind of just turn it off approach really minimizes just how nuanced and complex. And it's this blanket approach to survivor safety planning that we really need to move away from. Every safety plan has to be very unique to that survivor's circumstance. And as technology develops, that those blanket approaches just become less and less useful. So yeah, absolutely, it's a huge issue, and it really simplifies what are very complicated issues often.
In terms of options for, speaking of safety planning, um, I know that I can talk a little bit about some that we have here, and then I'd love to hear from you, like what actions you take in supporting survivors regain control of their connected environments. Um, we're very lucky in New York that we work with the Cornell Tech Clinic to End Tech Abuse, which is actually being taken over by Sanctuary. So we're becoming the Sanctuary Tech Abuse Clinic, where clients can get resources through our family justice centers. If people walk in and say, there's something going on with one of my devices, or even if not, even if they're not really sure what's happening, we really try to ask them about, do you have any connected devices in the home? Do you share any accounts with your abuser? Even if do you live with your abuser? If you don't, have you recently separated? Just trying to suss out like what possible access an abuser might have had to some of these devices, or even accounts, and they can go through and get an appointment with a volunteer technologist that are trained and supported from the tech abuse clinic, who goes through their devices with the survivor. It's all done remotely, and so they go through their accounts, their two-factor authentication, like all their different, possible connected accounts, and try to identify whether or not there has been any access, and if so, like where it came from. And very importantly, to your last point, conduct an individualized safety assessment, because identifying that there is access is one thing, but then the next step, I feel like sometimes people that are not familiar with this area, they just think, oh, we'll just turn it off. Like, no, actually, that could be very dangerous, right? If you're living with your abuser and all of a sudden they don't have access to your location and you go home to that person, there could be a really volatile and very dangerous environment, because now they've lost control, which we know working in DV, and I mean, you've worked in it for a while as well. Like we know that like that loss of control is is if not one of the most dangerous times, the most dangerous time for a survivor whenever they leave a relationship, if they're pregnant, some of these really high lethality factors when the abuser is losing control of that person. So we are grateful to have that resource. We're also trying to train, and we work very hard to train other advocates and other attorneys, other service providers, to be able to provide these kind of individualized safety planning and identifying of devices. But what do you do at Refuge and kind of around in your area?
Yeah, it's really interesting to learn about like the different models, isn't it? Because I think so many of our kind of services are actually they're still quite few and far between. So it's really interesting to hear how things are being kind of set up. And yeah, I mean, we work very, very similarly. So we've got different referral routes into our team. Some of them are localized, some of them are nationalized. But yeah, we can either provide direct support to survivors in certain circumstances, or we can also offer like case consultation structure as well. So we'll work directly with the key worker as well, which also kind of helps to upskill key workers as well around these
Mhm.
issues. And it's really great that I think we're having this conversation, because I hope everyone who's listening knows that support is available around these
Mhm.
issues, and that there
Mhm.
are things that can be done, because it can seem very, very doom and gloom. I love how you mentioned digital hygiene, those strong, secure password, that two-factor authentication. These things sound so simple. And when I'm delivering training on them, you often see a few people do some like eye rolls in the back of the session, but they can have an absolutely huge impact. Um, And for anyone who is unsure around how to secure this technology, Refuge has actually developed their a home tech tool, which is on our website. So it's refugetechsafety.org.uk, which basically walks the survivor through a house and highlights different forms of technology in the home and makes recommendations for how to, take steps to secure them. So things like Wi-Fi, for example, or, a Ring doorbell, these kind of things. So it's really, but the point I think you pulled out there, and we've kind of spoken about a little bit, is it's that personalized safety plan, I think, is the absolute key there. Um, Understanding what the survivor's priority is often overlooked as well. If a survivor is wishing to report to the police, they might wish to leave the smart home device compromised because steps to secure it could wipe the evidence. But it's good to know where you can get support and where you can get those guides if it is safe for that survivor to make changes. But not jumping straight to those steps, I think, and taking a bit of a moment to have that conversation and delve into their unique situation is so key. Absolutely.
I am so excited to hear about that resource because I did not know about that. So I think it's so wonderful to have these conversations because I'm gonna absolutely send people to there. Um, from a legal perspective, what is the situation with current like UK legislation around Internet of Things facilitated abuse? I know that in the past that I feel like there's been a lot of from the other side of the pond, we're looking to you guys for your attention to these issues because I feel like the UK has actually been a leader. But I'm curious about Internet of Things type work. Are there legislative gaps or things that you're kind of addressing in this space?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. I think from your legal insight, I'll be very interested to hear how things are looking in the US. The short answer is no. The UK legislation, I don't think, is really keeping pace with Internet of Things facilitated abuse. I'd really argue that it's not on anyone's radar, really.
Mm,
We have had a number of really positive legislative breakthroughs in terms of technology facilitated abuse more generally, but these have largely focused on things like intimate image-based abuse or social media, particularly under the Online Safety Act. And obviously, both are absolutely key areas that need addressing. I'm not trying to undermine or undervalue those like legislative processes at all, but widespread understanding and acknowledgement of smart home tech facilitated abuse is still very much in its infancy. And I think one of the biggest gaps in like the protection of survivors is that even if we don't have this specific legislation to hold perpetrators, criminally accountable for abuse through
mhm,
these devices, we can look at how we change our practices. This is easier, it's often a lot quicker, but yet we're still not often making those changes. So, you know, considering how we can use existing legislation like our Domestic Abuse Act, like coercive and controlling behaviour to really capture this kind of emerging harm, and how we can ensure, harm thresholds, which are always mentioned in the law, actually recognise the impact of this abuse. Because I think when we say things are posing, serious risk of harm, as
mhm.
we've mentioned already, there's still that kind of hierarchy of harm in the back of our minds. I think another thing is we need to be able to support, frontline policing and criminal justice teams to understand how to gather appropriate evidence for these crimes as well. Helping people understand that smart locks will have an interaction log sitting somewhere. Are you able to use that? And so we definitely do obviously need stronger legislation around this, but I think it's important to remember that we don't have to wait for the legislation before we can make changes. What does the legal landscape look like in New York and the US, as a whole and statewide as well?
I think probably similar, it sounds like. I mean, we have a lot of it is so kind of like ticky-tack and very responsive. Just like, again, like the connected cars, I think is fantastic. And New York and California, to my knowledge, are the only ones that, and I haven't checked in with a new legislative session because I know a lot of them are wrapping up, but I don't see other states doing that. I'm very glad that we have that in New York, but that's again one technology. That's one specific area. So we're also working, we have had in the law in New York GPS stalking, like stalking via GPS or other connected devices for quite a while because we tragically had a case about 10 years ago with a woman who was stalked using a GPS device and then killed by her ex-partner. So that was actually added to the law. But what we see in practice, I mean, going to your point about training and working with people on the ground, is that it's still not seen, it's still not prosecuted in the way or even taken reports at. That's been on the books since 2012. I've been an attorney since 2015 here in New York, and I've had dozens of conversations with law enforcement or others saying, well, we can't, prosecute based upon an AirTag found in the car, whereas I know it's a part of our stalking law. And so not just looking at what are the laws, but also how they're enforced and kind of trying to use, again, the existing law that we have, because and I'm sure you say this in your trainings too, what I always say is online stalking is stalking. Her online harassment is harassment. We don't have to create all new criminal penalties or civil penalties or whatever it may be to address new forms of abuse. This is the same forms of harm that we have seen since the dawn of time. They're just using a different tool to do it. So we wouldn't say, oh, well, if you hurt somebody with your hand versus a weapon, oh, we're going to create a whole separate crime. Oh, that's a whole, like, yes, it is. Maybe you have an aggravating circumstance, but it's the same thing, right? We're not going to say, oh, well, this one was you hit somebody with, a bat instead of your hand. Like, now we can't prosecute that because that's a totally separate crime. Like, no, of course not. You'd say, what do we have under the existing law? How can we apply this? Because the harm is very serious. And how do we deal with that?
Yeah. And I think also what comes onto this is we also need to be considering not just the responsibilities under the law and from frontline services, but also how these pieces of technology are designed in the first place. In your opinion, do you think that tech companies and these kind of device manufacturers are currently doing enough to kind of anticipate or prevent the misuse that we've been talking about in this conversation?
I think it totally depends on the tech company. I mean, on balance, on generally no. I do not think that this is certainly not the first or second or even third things that companies are thinking of when they're designing a product, right? They're not thinking, how is this going to be misused by an abuser? But we're seeing it happening so often. So I do think the importance of bringing tech companies into these conversations, of holding them accountable, of having these discussions, in whatever way it can be done. I know there's a lot of litigation around these things in the United States and kind of particularly around social media and the way that these products are designed. And we have colleagues here in New York, like Carrie Goldberg, who has been ringing this bell for a really long time about the product safety and ways that technology is designed. Like, you need to, it really is. It is like a product liability kind of issue, right? If I design a product in a way that I know can be misused and can be like that's a design flaw, right? If I have a car that, when you press the brake, it doesn't stop, like that's a bad car, right? You know that people are going to need to use the brake. So, um, it is a huge problem. I do think some companies are better than others. I know in the past that we've worked with Apple, for instance, on some of these issues about like unsending messages, and we raised concerns with kind of the time limit around when a message could be unsent, and we were very concerned that if the abuser sent a message and it was really scary and threatening, and then the abuser could unsend it for up to 15 minutes afterwards, we're like, that's way too long. That's really because if a client looks at this, they're not going to be thinking, oh, I need to screenshot this before it's removed. And so in response, Apple did decrease that time period. So there's so many, the thing is, it's so broad and there's so many new technologies that are coming out all the time and new updates that it's really, again, we're always playing catch up, but on balance, absolutely, this is not at the forefront, I think, of companies' minds, and it should be. And the more that we can push people and hold our companies accountable and legislators as well, the better. I don't know about your perspective on that.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think due to, domestic abuse and stalking is so prevalent. That is not an opinion, that is literally a proven fact at this point, just how expansive domestic abuse and stalking and harassment is now. So I think it is really important that you say that tech companies are speaking to support services, speaking to survivors as well, to
Yes.
better understand how these features can and are being misused before being released onto the market. But I think not only is there a proactive side to safety by design, I think there is a reactive side as well.
Mhm.
And I think we need a better route to support survivors to regain access to these devices post separation. We need ways for survivors of abuse to not lose access to this technology.
Mm.
But also we have to not have them have to decide between connection and increased risk or isolation and safety, potentially. Like, that sometimes feels like what survivors have to balance. Am I going to stay connected, but potentially have this risk sitting over me? Or am I going to completely digitally disengage, but risk being isolated? Um, I think having to get survivors to balance that at the moment is just not practical in modern society. And that's why not only do we have to ensure we're thinking about survivors' experiences at the, design stage, we also need to make sure they're able to regain control of those accounts if they do experience abuse.
Yeah, such a good point. And I think bringing in survivors into the spaces and asking on the ground. I know then in our work, we work extensively with survivors. We have a survivor group. We've had survivor listening sessions in the trainings that I do to law enforcement and hearing what people are experiencing directly from them rather than from support services or law enforcement or whoever it may be is just such a critical point. And thank you so much for raising that. Finally, both of us have been in this space for a long time, and I know it's hard because we've talked and we're like, all these problems, all these things are so bad, and they are. Um, but I am, what positive things, if any, have you seen? I will say, from my perspective, I co-chair the New York Cyber Abuse Task Force, or now I chair the New York Cyber Abuse Task Force, which is a group of agencies, nonprofits, some law enforcement, but mostly civil attorneys, organizations, clinicians, survivors, researchers, students, all around this space. And we have been able to, I think, just coming together as a group, like create really helpful resources, or what I hope are helpful resources, right? To train legislators, to train law enforcement and judges and all these different folks, or even just advocates around this space. And I have seen, again, a handful, I think, of helpful pieces of legislation. But the biggest thing I think that has been positive is an increased awareness around these issues and an increased attention to it, both by us, like as survivor supporter services, but also by the general public, understanding that these are issues and not having people have to feel like they have to explain, not even just explain themselves, but just be believed, right? That these things can happen. So I do have some hope in that area that I think that even in the last like 5 years, that I've seen a big increase in, 10 years ago, I think people would just tell survivors that they were crazy and that wasn't happening to them and that they just need to, deal with it or just get offline. Um, but what if any positives do have you seen in your work and kind of growing forward?
I mean, I think my positive is exactly the same as you, not to sound too
Mhm.
much like a broken record, but
I love it.
yeah, it's great. I think this awareness aspect is really improving. I think there's so many more people who, even if they don't know stuff, they are willing to come forward and say that and go, look, I know this is a gap in our knowledge. Help us understand this issue because we know this isn't an issue that's going away. And I think the amount of people who are looking at understanding domestic abuse and tech facilitated abuse in its entirety is really, really positive. People aren't just coming forward saying they want to learn about something specific. They are coming forward saying, we know this is broader than our understanding. Help us understand just how broad. And also that cross-sector learning, I think, is happening more and more. For similarly to you and your team, we work with we've done work with the Ministry of Justice. We've done work with, various police forces, various support organisations, for-profit companies. And I really think if we can get support services, police, criminal justice, tech companies to all really understand the issue at hand, we'd be much better faced to kind of face the challenges together. We can stop just talking about the issue and actually
Mhm.
take the steps needed to protect survivors. So I think we shouldn't undervalue the impact that just awareness and understanding really has, particularly for the survivors experiencing this abuse.
I think that's such a good point to end on, and it was lovely having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, it's so nice to hear all about the amazing work you and your team are doing. So thank you.